Welcome to HR Studio Podcast. Through bi-weekly interviews with HR executives, thought leaders, authors, speakers, and trend spotters from the world of HR and beyond, we invite you to listen, learn, and leverage. Welcome to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. HR Studio Podcast is brought to you by A.J. O'Connor Associates, a trusted human capital consulting partner to emerging, mid-market, and world-class organizations. To learn more, visit us at ajoconnor.com.
Great. So welcome, everyone, to HR Studio Podcast. I'm Fred Bunsa. I'm going to be your host for today's episode, and we're really thrilled to have Dr. Keri Ohlrich with us. Keri is the founder of the Abbracci Group, and the tagline was very interesting to us, an unconventional HR consulting firm. So we want to dig in a little bit there and how they do assessment and action planning. But Keri has a really strong pedigree of degrees. She has a PhD in human development and organizational systems from Fielding. She's got 2 master's degrees, one of which is in global human resources, and then she's got a BS in psychology and business. So covered the whole gamut there, Keri, with your schooling, incredibly impressive. And a couple of months ago, released a new book called The Way of the HR Warrior, where she and her co-author, Monice Frede, talk about we're going to talk about the book a little bit, the role of the HR warrior and how that plays out for our audience of HR listeners. So, Keri, it's so good to have you on HR Studio Podcast today.
Thank you. Great to be on. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
Your thesis is that there's a revolution going on in HR, and with Disrupt HR and so many other organizations out there, we would tend to agree that we're all feeling the need for a lot of change and for driving more change and more innovation. So tell us your perspective a little bit on what you see behind this HR revolution.
Yes. It's interesting with all those degrees and schooling. I never thought I'd go in HR. So I think, I was like, I'm not going to be in corporate, and yet here I am. So what's interesting about the HR revolution is I think when I started in HR, the profession itself wasn't as respected as I would hope. People kind of chuckled and was like, why are you in HR? I had a family member who was in operations all the time, and all I heard was stories about how she disliked HR. And so when you look at, and I think about like all the technological advances we have, right? And there's so many, and we, went from a typewriter to a computer and a corded phone to a cell phone. But when I look at like leadership and the state of people, it doesn't seem like we make those leapfrog advances that we have in technology. So what's going on? And so how can HR and how can our profession really help these companies figure out the human aspect? Because we can have AI and we can have robots, but we still always have humans, and we still always have the psychology of humans, which I love and also makes me exhausted at the same time. So that HR revolution is how can we as a profession push forward and really be more of business people kind of minding the humans versus party planners versus getting the coffee versus like, well, I have to fire someone, so can you do it for me, Keri? So instead, how can we actually push forward and really be, you hear it all the time, the seat at the table, but it really is kind of just business people who we watch after the HR. And we bring in that perspective, just like finance brings in the financial perspective, just like IT brings in the IT perspective. We need to bring in the human perspective and how to be an engaging culture. And now with people also being able to choose jobs wherever, that culture is really important, right? How you treat people, what you stand for. And now with remote workforce as well, I can work wherever. So I have a client who everyone is remote. They hire wherever they can. If they hire in Houston, that's great. If they hire in Seattle, that's great as well. And their headquarters is in the East Coast. So they don't care where they're located. So that culture better be really good to attract people.
When you talk about this revolution, one thought I have is does HR attract people who have a hard time thinking that way? Or is it the businesses and the leaders that we serve have historically been so attached to the compliance parent-oriented HR department that's really the obstacle? Do you have a point of view on what's getting in the way there?
Yeah, I think I have 2. So let's take, for me, kind of the easier one is the business one. So the business itself, and again, I remember this family member I have who told me stories about how they usually picked the person who was about to be fired to run HR.
Oh
This is
boy.
like the 80s and the 70s. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, this is kind
Back
of
in
where
the
you have
day.
to know your history, right? You have to know your history. You have to know kind of where we came from. And it was like, Paul's not doing well, but he seems to like people. So like put him in charge of HR. And then you have the compliance piece where it's just keep us out of legal trouble. And I think a lot of leaders still feel that way, right? I interviewed a leader and I said, what do you want out of HR? Like, what does successful HR look like to you? And he said, Cobra and keep me out of jail. And I'm like, anything else? He goes, nope, I want you in the background.
Oh boy. Okay.
Well, right? So, okay. But good to know that that's what he wants. But that's what he wants. Now, I think others are evolving. And so when you have those leaders who care so much about HR, you're so happy as an HR person because you sometimes can't be as successful as you want to be if you don't have a really good leader. So I think we see companies evolving and getting it a little bit more, but it definitely started from a one down position, right? We weren't as respected as finance. It was kind of like we had to do it because the government says we have to have some kind of compliance. And it wasn't as necessary. Plus, I mean, most people stayed at their job for 30 years, so was it really necessary? Do you know what I mean? You stayed at your job, you might have had a crappy boss, but did companies really need to flex that muscle? They really didn't. And now all of a sudden we've turned it around and we're like, oh, I can quit, I can leave. I mean, we've changed that employment contract. So I think employers, they definitely have some piece of it where they've kept HR down because it wasn't necessary, it wasn't important, it was kind of a pain in the butt legal thing. Then you add, and this is where maybe I'll get in trouble, but then again, I tend to get in trouble. So for the HR piece, when I used to interview people, I can hear people yelling at me now. If people said, I like people, that's why I'm in HR.
Right.
Don't tell me that. I don't want to hire you now. Now, I really like characters and I like people and I like the human experience, but I am not in HR because I want people to like me and I like people. There's this very fine line between I wanted people to like me and party planners and shoot t-shirts out of cannons and do fun stuff like that and have people really like me. HR is usually the profession where no one likes you. Like people make fun of you when you walk into the room. And so I think that we have as a profession picked people who I like people and I want to make them happy. So I think I'm going to go into HR. And when you do that, that is not where you make people happy in HR. You should be in sales. Do you know what I mean? Even finance makes people happier than HR half the time. So I do think sometimes we pick, you know what I mean? We think and it's pretty female dominated now, HR as well. So there's kind of this pleasing, I can be around people and be happy. And that isn't helping the situation either.
Yeah. So what's a way forward? I mean, we've got on our HR Studio podcast, we've got a number of rising HR leaders as well as senior HR leaders. What would you suggest? Let's start with the folks who are maybe in early or mid-career, those rising leaders. What can they do to break down some of those biases and also do a bit of a gut check for themselves?
Yeah, I think let's take the gut check. I think when we really thought about what are those fundamental qualities for an HR person, because that to me, if you have those fundamental qualities, I'll hire someone who has no HR experience if they have those fundamental qualities, right? And one of them is that resilience, that you won't be appreciated sometimes, you won't be liked. Do you know what I mean? You have to make really hard decisions. You also are around a lot of drama. I mean, you are around when people lose their positions or they get promoted or they do something naughty or something like that. And so if you don't have the resilience to go through those things and understand humans from a more scientific perspective versus enabling, if that makes sense. Do you know what I mean? You can't be so involved with them that you're crying with them all the time, although I've cried, don't get me wrong. But how can you have that resilience to bounce back? Because in HR, we have a really hard, first hour of the day because someone got fired. And then the next hour is you have to interview people and say why it's good to be there.
And tell why you love the organization. It's a little schizophrenic.
Right. And you were behind the scenes listening to a manager say stuff that you're like, wow, if that was on camera, holy smoke, would that be wrong? Do you know what I mean? You have to figure that out. So I think if you don't have that thick skin or that resilience, HR is really tough. This is when you say that gut check. is that, can I handle that kind of drama, and that kind of mental just toughness and agility I need? And then I also think there's the fundamental quality of just courage, right? So when you're starting off your career, it's trust me, I have way more courage than I did 20 years ago. But especially in HR, how do you stand up and say something that doesn't sound fair, that doesn't sound right? How can we give them an extra severance? How can we give them that promotion that we promised instead of just kind of ignoring it and hoping it goes away? How can we stand up and do something really good for the employees and recognize them? That kind of courage. If it is really hard for someone to be assertive, it is hard for them to kind of go against the grain.
Right.
I think HR is a really tough profession. And that's why I think some of the people, and again, this is hard for humans in general, not just HR, but to speak out, to be resilient. It's just HR is in the position to do some amazing things for people, and then not so amazing, right? And if you don't have that kind of inner assertiveness and drive to do it, not saying you can't do it, you just really got to get in the headspace and get a coach and get kind of just work that muscle, because it's tough work. It's tough. Don't underestimate how tough the job is.
And so, I think we our organization does a lot of coaching with leaders and HR people as well, and it's that one is a common challenge for us in the HR space. And but I like the word you use, a muscle. It's like it's a muscle that you have to exercise and flex and stretch and find some safe places to use it, and then find some more challenging places to use it. But it does get easier. It does become stronger in your ability to use it and use it well.
It does. And it's really, I mean, again, if I look back at the things I did when I first started, I can go like, oh my God, right? But I've gotten better at it, and I've calmed myself down, and I've had the injustice of how could they not do this, and the upset, do you know what I mean? And so you find ways to work that muscle and get in better shape with it.
That's great. So you talked about resilience, talked about courage. Is there one other character trait you could say, or that you would recommend for those early in the career?
I think especially early in the career, HR has a bad reputation. I've heard this just about everywhere I've gone. So if people could do this early in the career, it'd be awesome. Follow up, do what you say you're going to do. I know it's stupid. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's like, come on, that's like, you should, oh my God, if you could do that, if you could do what you say you're going to do, if you tell a supervisor you're going to help and you're going to figure out a compensation range or whatever it is, and you're going to do it by Friday, do it by Friday, or tell them you can't do it. And the reason is again, because knowing the history of HR and knowing that we kind of go, oh, they're just party planners and what do they do? And sometimes, honestly, people don't know what we do because they can't. Because we can't tell them for 10 hours we've been behind closed doors trying to figure out what the merit pool should be, right? So if they don't know that, then they're just thinking you're just sitting there planning a party. And why couldn't you get to my work on Friday?
Sure.
Instead, you're going to do it Friday. So I've seen people in HR, if they don't deliver on what they say they're going to deliver, those goals, people kind of go to that negative stereotype. And then it's like, well, I don't really think she does anything. I mean, I don't see her delivering anything. And so it's so important to deliver actual work and keep your promises.
Well, and it's just human nature that if you deliver on that work, there's going to be a more openness to what you have to say when you do need to be courageous and stand up and push back on a decision or an attitude or something that you see that's not healthy.
Exactly. It's so right, because it's all about building that trust, right? And so if I have the trust of this leader, then I can be more courageous, because they're like, all right, well, okay, I mean, Keri's done stuff in the past. Okay, I kind of believe that what she's saying. But if I've never delivered, and then I come in and say, you should do this, you know what they're going to think? You should probably have done what I asked you to do last Friday too.
Right.
Yeah. Right? They're going to be like, and you didn't do what you said, so why should I listen to you?
Yeah.
So
Keri, so resilience, courage, and follow up, delivering the goods, maybe you could call it that. For HR people early in their career, good things to anchor to. What about for people who are more senior in their HR journey?
Yeah, I think, hopefully you've built that foundation, right? And so you have that. And so I've unfortunately seen some senior leaders who have not had that foundation, and that's not good. But I think when you're running that team and you're in that visible position, what even becomes harder, I think, as a senior leader in HR is that integrity piece, right? Because everyone's looking at you. And if you don't run as well as you tell everyone else to, do you know what I'm saying? Then your team is wholly discounted. And I'll give you a quick example. I worked for someone who he was the VP. He had some people on his team who perhaps some other people, like other leaders, were like, they don't seem that high functioning, right? High performing. And so when he coached another leader to remove low performers for her team, her response is, you don't do it. You don't do it, so why should I listen to you?
Okay.
Right? I mean, like, ouch. But especially when you're in that high level of like a CHRO, vice president, director of a team, you are not doing the day-to-day compliance. Like, you don't know what minimum wage is anymore at that level. Do you know what I'm saying? Like that kind of like stuff, those details, you don't know anymore. You don't have to know it. You have a team to know it. But the other leaders who are wondering, should we trust her? Should we do work with her? Should we listen to her advice? They're looking at you. And if you don't do your development plans, if you don't manage your team, if you don't give feedback the right way, you don't do all that, all eyes are on you. And then you lose the brand, the trust, and then that damages your whole team all the way down. Because if they don't trust the CHRO, guess what? I'm like, they're like, yeah, I heard about HR. You're like, no, I'm actually decent. They're like, yeah, whatever.
Yeah, I just think about the parallel of if you had a finance person who was continually going over budgets,
yes,
or just not, handing in, not hitting quarterly deadlines and things like that. It just their whole enterprise starts to suffer from that leader's reputation.
Right. And the problem is HR is so visible. And so it goes back to, again, kind of if you're junior in the career, you just started, understand that HR is a visible, people know you. You work with so many people. And so you can't hide. I mean, the finance person, maybe she goes over budget, but who really knows that? Do you know what I mean? Like maybe a couple other people do, but maybe not everyone. But in HR, if you don't manage your employees, right, everyone's going to know that. And they're going to be like, yeah, that person's a train wreck. But HR keeps them around.
Yeah.
So,
and the HR team by its nature is interacting with the rest of the organization. So it's a visible crew.
It is. It's very visible. And so you kind of have to always be on your best behavior. And it's super difficult. Trust me. I mean, I haven't been on my best behavior at all times. I know these lessons because I've learned them the hard way.
Yes, we all have. Well, so in your book, The HR Warrior, you talk about the charge model, and we've been actually talking about it without calling it out, but I just want to call it out. So the charge stands for courageous, humble, accurate, resilient, goal-oriented, and exemplary.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about how you and your co-author came up with the charge model.
It really was working in HR, again, like I mentioned, never thought I was going to be in HR. Working in HR and having quite a few leaders say to me, don't like HR, here's why, which I appreciated. They told me because then you could do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, well, good, I'm going to change it, right? And success with the majority, some not so much. But the ones who I was successful with kind of dug into why was that, right? And then I'm like, because other people need that help. And it's not I was just strategic, right? Like strategic's important and I understand the business and stuff, but there was something else that was beneath why I was successful with them. Mm-hmm. And so then Monica and we worked together and we saw a lot of HR people not do so well and get made fun of, and people roll their eyes when they're in the room and all this. Mm-hmm. And so kind of using what we did plus what they're not doing, right? And kind of just started talking about what are those fundamental qualities? Because Monica is sports, like she's a basketball star. And so we're always talking about fundamentals, right? And that's boring. Fred, no one wants to talk about the fundamentals.
Right, let's run some cool plays. Forget about drills and fundamentals.
Right. It is so boring. I always joke, like, no one wants to talk about building bridges, like, until the bridge falls apart. And then you're like, why didn't we do that? And you're like, well, because for 10 years we told you to, like, up that bridge, like, make a better bridge. So it's really super boring. So, but we thought if you don't have it, you can't talk about being at the table, being strategic, using artificial intelligence, using all this like great stuff that we're so jazzed about, if you don't have the fundamentals. Because if the leader doesn't trust you, that's it. And so really the whole charge model goes toward building a great relationship with your leader, having the trust. And that's kind of why we created it. And then we just, then we came up with, because it's HR. So we came up with a fun, charge, warrior, cute. And then, yeah.
Got it. It. That sounds great. So as we begin to wrap up our episode today, Keri, what do you have any advice, one or two things that HR people you just want to emphasize, or some new ideas that they can use to help guide them in this challenging environment of there's some bias against HR. HR really needs to shift, and they might be not so sure of their ability to demonstrate these new kinds of required behaviors.
Yeah, I think, one is know yourself. Do you know what I mean? It's that self-awareness. Right. And knowing, is this right for me? Which we talked about earlier. And it might not be, and that's okay. But like, be true to yourself and know what you want to do. And if you don't like to be courageous and you kind of want to go along with the flow, then maybe sometimes HR isn't for you. That's okay. But like really start the new year with looking at yourself and figuring that out. Really important. Once you figure yourself out, then it's now look at my company, right? And really, it's in HR, and I've done it too. We're at a company for too long thinking, I can change them, right? Sometimes as enablers, we tend to go like, no, he'll get it soon. If I can just say it one more time. Totally guilty of it. And there could be a point where you're like, you know what, this isn't good for me or my career. And so to make some tough decisions. So I think there's a lot of introspection that needs to be done for HR people. And we're usually so busy and so crazy that we don't do it. And we don't develop ourselves. So how can HR folks take time to develop themselves, really figure out what they want to do, what they want to be in their career, and then figure out if the company is right for them. So that would be amazing. That would be a revolution if people started doing that and taking some time for themselves as well.
That would be awesome. And, it seems like with the way the economy has improved over the last number of years, and where companies are actually starting to pay attention to their employees, to culture, to the vibe and the environment and the user experience, the employee experience, as it were. I think there's an opportunity for us in HR to be able to really impact that in a much greater way than when people were just happy to be holding on to their jobs, 5 or 10 years ago during the great downturn of things. So this is really helpful information, Keri. And so I just want to call it out again. The HR Warrior is Keri's book. It's available. And if you see the show notes, we'll have some links to it there. So, Keri, thank you so much for being with us today, for sharing your insights about how all of us can be a bit more of an HR warrior as our career grows. So we really appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Welcome to HR Studio Podcast. Through bi-weekly interviews with HR executives, thought leaders, authors, speakers, and trend spotters from the world of HR and beyond, we invite you to listen, learn, and leverage. Welcome to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. HR Studio Podcast is brought to you by A.J. O'Connor Associates, a trusted human capital consulting partner to emerging, mid-market, and world-class organizations. To learn more, visit us at ajoconnor.com.